For 50 years, one government blamed the Nazis for the murder of thousands of prisoners. Then the sealed files were opened, and proved the government itself had ordered every execution. By the end, you'll see how the Katyn massacre was planned, disguised, and defended by an entire state, and how one signature changed the accepted history of World War II. The story begins in September 1939. Nazi Germany invades Poland from the west. 16 days later, the Soviet Union enters from the east under a secret agreement that divides the country between them. Poland collapses beneath two armies. The Soviets capture hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens. Among them are military officers, police commanders, doctors, engineers, professors, lawyers, and government officials. These are not random prisoners. They represent the educated backbone of the Polish state, precisely the people capable of organizing resistance. Thousands are transported to isolated prison camps deep inside Soviet territory. Letters reach their families through the winter. They describe cold barracks, interrogations, hunger, and uncertainty. Then, in the spring of 1940, the letters stop. Not gradually. Almost all at once. Prisoners are removed from the camps in tightly controlled groups. Soviet records describe the transfers as routine. Families receive no explanation. No release notices arrive. No confirmed sightings follow. More than 20,000 people effectively disappear. And for the next 3 years, the world has no idea where they went. In 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union. Former allies become enemies, and German forces push through Soviet-held territory. Near Smolensk, local rumors point toward a forest where trucks had once arrived at night. In 1943, mass graves are uncovered there. Inside are thousands of Polish officers, many still wearing their uniforms. Their hands are bound. Personal letters and identification papers remain in their pockets. Most were killed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. The place is called Katyn Forest. German authorities announced that Soviet security forces committed the murders in 1940. They bring foreign observers to the site and turn the graves into wartime propaganda. The Soviets immediately deny everything. Moscow claims the prisoners had remained alive until German forces captured the area in 1941. According to this version, the Nazis executed them and then fabricated older evidence to frame the Soviet Union. Both regimes are known mass murderers. Both manipulate information. Both manufacture documents. So the question becomes brutally difficult. Which government is lying about the dead? The Polish government in exile asks the International Red Cross to investigate. That request should have been simple. Instead, Stalin calls it an act of collaboration with Hitler and breaks diplomatic relations with the Poles. Britain and the United States are now trapped. Their military alliance with the Soviet Union is essential to defeating Nazi Germany. Publicly accusing Stalin of killing Allied Polish officers could fracture the coalition while the war is still raging. Behind closed doors, officials examine the available clues. The victims' letters end in 1940. Newspapers and diaries recovered from the bodies contain no entries later than that spring. Tree growth above the graves suggests the burial site predates German occupation. The physical evidence points east, toward Moscow. But political necessity points in the opposite direction. Allied leaders avoid a direct confrontation. Reports are restricted. Doubts are softened. The Soviet explanation is allowed to stand publicly, even as many officials privately suspect it is false. The war has created a terrible calculation: justice for the dead, or unity against Hitler. Unity wins. But before the sealed files can expose who gave the order, you need to understand something even stranger. The lie did not end when the war ended. It became official history. After Soviet forces retake the region, Moscow creates its own investigative commission. Its conclusion is predetermined: German troops committed the massacre in 1941. Witnesses are pressured to change their statements. The burial timeline is rewritten. Soviet authorities produce testimony supporting the new version. Then they attempt something even more ambitious. At the Nuremberg trials, Soviet prosecutors accuse German forces of responsibility for Katyn. The charge does not produce a judgment against the Germans, but Moscow continues presenting its story as settled fact. Inside Communist Poland, questioning that story becomes dangerous. Public memorials use carefully selected dates. Books repeat the approved account. Teachers know which explanation is permitted. Families of the murdered officers learn that even speaking openly can invite surveillance or punishment. Katyn is transformed from a crime into a test of obedience. You are not merely expected to accept the Soviet version. You are expected to distrust the letters, the graves, the dates, and your own missing relatives. For decades, the lie survives through repetition, censorship, and fear. Yet the story never disappears completely. Polish families preserve letters, photographs, and fragments of testimony in private. Names are memorized. Dates are whispered. Empty chairs remain at family tables. Outside the Soviet bloc, independent researchers compare burial evidence with prisoner records. Defectors and former officials add pieces to the picture. Western investigations increasingly conclude that Soviet forces carried out the executions. Moscow responds with the same denial. Year after year. Decade after decade. Even the phrase, Katyn massacre, becomes dangerous because it raises the question the state cannot tolerate: if this version of history is false, what else has been rewritten? Then the Soviet system begins to weaken. In the late 1980s, reform and greater openness create narrow spaces for investigation. Polish researchers demand access to records. Soviet journalists examine contradictions that had once been untouchable. The official narrative starts cracking. But suspicion is not the same as proof. To end the argument, investigators need the original decision, preserved somewhere inside the Soviet archive. In 1990, the Soviet Union finally acknowledges that its secret police were responsible. It is a historic admission, but it still leaves the central machinery concealed. Who authorized the killings? How high did the decision go? And had the executions been the work of local officers, or a deliberate policy approved at the top? The most sensitive records remain locked away. Then the Soviet Union collapses. Power shifts. Archives open unevenly. Officials search collections once reserved for the highest levels of government. And inside a sealed archival package, they find documents that had survived war, dictatorship, and half a century of denial. The papers do not describe an accident. They describe a decision. Here is what the files showed. On March 5, 1940, Secret Police Chief Lavrentiy Beria sent Joseph Stalin a proposal concerning thousands of Polish prisoners. The document labeled them hardened enemies of Soviet power and recommended that their cases be handled through a special procedure. With the supreme penalty: death. No public trials. No defense attorneys. No chance to answer the accusations. Stalin approved it. His signature appeared on the document alongside those of other senior Soviet leaders. The killings that followed were systematic. Prisoners were transported in groups, identified, restrained, and executed. Their bodies were placed in mass graves at Katyn and other sites. Then the state erased them from the official record and spent 50 years blaming someone else. Another document from 1959 went further. It recommended destroying thousands of individual prisoner files because they offered no operational value and risked exposing the truth. The murders had been organized from the top. And the cover-up had been maintained from the top. This was the proof the families had waited half a century to see. The documents did more than identify the killers. They changed the meaning of the entire story. Katyn was not simply a battlefield atrocity committed in confusion. It was a calculated attempt to remove a nation's military and intellectual leadership. The denial was not an improvised response to German propaganda. It became a long-term state project involving fabricated conclusions, controlled education, diplomatic pressure, and censorship. And the Western silence was no longer easy to describe as uncertainty alone. Officials had seen evidence pointing towards Soviet responsibility, but the demands of war made the truth politically inconvenient. That is the darker lesson inside the archive. History is not only shaped by what happened. It is shaped by which evidence governments release, which witnesses they silence, and which truths their allies decide they cannot afford to confront. A sealed folder can protect a lie longer than the people who created it remain alive. Today, the Katyn massacre stands as one of the clearest examples of how mass murder can be followed by the attempted murder of memory itself. More than 20,000 victims are associated with the wider execution operation. Their names survived because families, researchers, and witnesses refused to let the official version become the final one. But archives rarely open all at once. Questions over missing records, legal responsibility, and the full scope of disclosure have continued long after the central order became public. The files changed the story. But they also exposed how fragile historical certainty can be. Sometimes the difference between accepted history and an official lie is a single document waiting behind a locked door. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. And next time, they classified this photograph for decades. We finally know what it shows. Because sometimes a government can bury a document. But one photograph can bring the entire story back.